Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. Shall we dance? Tonight we shall discuss the 1967 film, The Fearless Vampire Killers, formerly titled Dance of the Vampires, written, directed, and starring the infamous Roman Polanski. You might know him as the director of such films as Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown, and The Pianist, and also as the guy who fled America because if he sets foot in this country again, he'll be imprisoned for the rape of a 13-year-old girl he hired as a model. Now there's a story.
And the Oscar goes to Roman Polanski.
Despite pleading guilty to sex with a minor in 1977, Polanski continued to have a successful film career, receiving countless awards and the support of his peers. But this film happened 10 years before all that. Perhaps in his early career, he wasn't yet the kind of powerful industry man who would take advantage of women under his employ. Okay, even here, where he's playing a sweet and innocent nice guy character, he's a perv. This film also stars Sharon Tate, who he married after they fell in love while making this. She would be murdered 2 years later by the Manson family, while 8 months pregnant with his child. But this movie is a comedy! A vampire comedy, conceived by Polanski and his buddy co-writer Gerard Brach as a loving spoof of their favorite Hammer horror Dracula movies. You know, the ones Christopher Lee made famous, where the vampire is a dignified, refined, yet intimidating aristocrat. Hammer's British approach to vampires was both classier and sexier than Hollywood's sterile, repressed vampires of the time. But unlike films like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein or later vampire movies which recreate scenes or mock classic characters from existing movies, Fearless Vampire Killers is an original story with original characters. It is the genre itself being spoofed, the very atmosphere of gothic horror, not so much the stories or even the vampires themselves. The fearless vampire killers in question are two bumbling morons who utterly fail to kill any vampires, and even though they are ostensibly the heroes of the story, they are both the butt of most of the comedy, such as it is. The movie is just not very funny. By modern standards at least. I mean, it is 50 years old. It has a few great moments, but it's long and super slow, and the jokes are subtle, with sparse, mumbling dialogue that's often incomprehensible. It's got a cult fan base, but even most people who enjoyed it back in the day consider it something of an acquired taste. The film's original title, Dance of the Vampires, is silly, but it was changed for American audiences to The Fearless Vampire Killers, or Pardon Me, But Your Teeth Are in My Neck, reminiscent of Dr. Strangelove or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. The American producers also tried to make the film funnier by recutting it, redubbing the actors, and adding this cartoon before the opening credits. The result was terrible, and nobody watches this version anymore, but the title stuck. It's a good title. Besides just being ironic, as the would-be killers are quite full of fear, the subtitle's tone is polite, soft. It implies stupidity and utter failure to do their job. Pardon me, but your teeth are in my neck. If you wouldn't mind letting up there, my good man, I have got to go find some vampires to kill. What? You're a vampire? How would I have ever guessed? Of course, I love that the hunters are the butts of all the jokes, not the vampires. They get to remain legitimately creepy and terrifying for the most part, as they rightly should. Now, we all know why people make fun of poor vampires nowadays. But back in 1967, before the deluge, when blood-red eyes still had the audiences screaming in theater seats, why would anyone think to make a comedy out of something as dark and scary as vampires?
Count Dracula sleeps in this coffin, but rises every night at sunset. Chick is right. This is awful silly stuff.
Horror comedy was hardly a new genre, though it had only been explored a bit in film so far. But it had special significance to Roman Polanski. Despite being a UK production and spoofing British vampires, the film has a distinctly Eastern European flavor to it. Eastern Europe, of course, is the original home of the most pervasive vampire legends, tied closely with Roman Catholic folklore. Polanski was born in 1933 to Polish-Jewish parents, and he was 6 years old when he saw Nazis march his mother and father off to concentration camps. Even though he was adapting another survivor story, he used a lot of his own experiences in The Pianist as well. Though his parents raised him atheist, Polanski survived the Holocaust as a child in the Krakow ghetto by pretending to be a Roman Catholic. The war shattered Poland. A huge portion of its population was exterminated, and the Catholics in the region were torn between the anti-Semitic nationalists siding with the Nazis and the communists siding with Russia. A lose-lose situation. The first film to depict this environment was 1942's To Be or Not to Be, a comedy, making a statement about laughter at death's door. And Polanski's film follows in these footsteps. How does one process the scars of such a truly horrific childhood? Humor in the face of death is one way. The vampire is the embodiment of death, a walking corpse that feasts on blood and spreads death in an unstoppable plague. And the film does blend genuine horror with its comedy. The scene where the damsel in distress is abducted by the evil vampire is heartbreakingly tragic. Also, just look how amazingly creepy that castle is. I want to go to there. And the end of this film is ridiculously bleak, even as it bookends the film's opening. It starts with old Professor Ambrosius and his young assistant Alfred traveling to deepest Transylvania to hunt vampires. They've never seen one before, but the professor is convinced they exist, and he's made it his mission to destroy them. When they discover garlic covering a local inn and the peasants lie about there being any suspicious spooky castles in the area, he decides he's finally found them. He's right, of course, but the film takes forever to actually get to the vampires. After the evil Count von Krolak abducts the innkeeper's hot daughter Sarah, the professor and Alfred go to his castle to rescue her. There, they pretend to be bat researchers, and the Count invites them to stay the night. Day. See, they don't know he knows they know he's a vampire. Comedy. They have the chance to kill the vampires during the day, but Alfred chickens out, and when he finds Sarah, she doesn't want to be rescued because she's too excited about the fancy ball happening at midnight. During the ball, they rescue her anyway and escape the castle, but it's too late. She's already a vampire, and she bites Alfred, and the professor unwittingly slays them off to civilization to spread their plague across the world. See, he's a vampire slayer after all! Get it? Slayer, because he's driving a sleigh, but not, yeah, I'll show myself out. So yeah, a ridiculously bleak ending, but also bleakly ridiculous, transforming horror into the absurd as a therapeutic coping tactic. As representations of death and decay to be laughed at, the vampires are presented in this film as an aristocracy that's descended from decadence to degeneracy, clinging to the trappings of their glory days of previous centuries even as their bodies deteriorate. And yet, they dance. The Midnight Ball, the titular dance of the vampires, is a literal danse macabre, harkening back to the popular motif from the late Middle Ages. A memento mori meant to remind the audience of the fragility of their lives, and how vain the glories of earthly life are. It's why it's good to invest in decorative skulls, they help keep things in perspective, and they're so cute. Anyway, as we all know, vampires love to dance. No. Are you kidding me? Marginally better. The Midnight Ball is a reference to Hammer's Kiss of the Vampire, though this was the first time they danced in a ballroom with a mirror showing only the human reflections, and we've seen that a few times since.
Don't we make a lovely couple?
The vampires rise to dance once a year, hail Satan, and feast on mortal blood. Last year, all they had to eat was a gross old woodcutter, but this year, Sarah is the main course, and they are all quite excited. Though she's neck-raped in her bathtub and abducted against her will, by the time she's there, she's kind of into it, which, in the context of the vampire as a rapist, ties back to Victorian ideas. Not only is he taking from her body, but he's also raping her mind, her very soul. His sin becomes her sin, transforming her from an innocent into someone attracted to evil. And as she's no longer 100% pure, she's therefore lost all her value as a woman, according to Victorian society. But this is a comedy, so how to make rape funny? Well, what if it happened to a man instead of a woman? After all, one fall from grace doesn't ruin a man for life, so, though when a female vampire preys on a man, it's sexy. Yeah, Hammer definitely taught us that. How to make it unsexy? What if it was a male vampire treating a man the way girls in these films are so often treated? Yeah, how does that feel, Alfred? Taste of your own pervy medicine there, 'cause homophobic gay panic is hilarious. This is Herbert, the Count's son, inspired by Hammer's first pretty boy vampire, Baron Meinster from The Brides of Dracula. And Herbert vaunts Alfred. But interestingly, even though he's foppish and spends half his time running around with no pants on, he's still framed as a frightening threat. The humor comes from Alfred's bumbling reactions, from him being put in a typical female position, not Herbert being made a fool. There is one completely comedic vampire, but he is the odd one out. Actually, an outsider. A new vampire, not part of the classist aristocracy. This is Chagall, Sarah's innkeeper father. After she's abducted, he fails to rescue her and gets turned. Because he's Jewish, the Catholic vampire hunting tactics don't work on him. But he's also treated like a second-class citizen, forced to sleep in the stables instead of the crypt with the Count, who has a German name and would dominate the world with his superior race. Though Chagall serves as comic relief and is a largely unsympathetic character considering his lecherousness even before he becomes a monster, knowing Polanski's background, you can't ignore the statements he makes with this Jewish character. A common theme in many of Polanski's films is the contrast between master and servant, between the ones in power versus those who are powerless. Besides the vampire's general perception of humans existing as a crop to be harvested for their disposal, we see it in the individual character dynamics. The way Chagall treats his daughter and the housemaid, the way the professor even treats Alfred. The consequences of bullying come back to bite them. Literally! All of this conscientious awareness of the impact of taking advantage of power dynamics is horribly ironic considering what went down with Roman Polanski 10 years later. And then apparently 4 more times?
He was carrying away with him the very evil he had wished to destroy. Thanks to him, this evil would at last be able to spread across the world.
Of course, we can't talk about this movie without at least mentioning the musical. Yes, you heard me right. 30 years after it came out, someone thought it would be a good idea to make a musical out of this slow, plodding, mumbling film. That person was Roman Polanski. He directed it himself and hired 80s power ballad king Jim Steinman to do the music. It premiered in Austria in 1997 and has become a long-running smash hit all over Europe and Tokyo. Oh yeah, the musical's huge. It's playing in Vienna right now if you want to go see it. Take me with you. It's a Eurotrash-style rock opera spectacular and quite different from the visually beautiful but dreary movie. Jim Steinman only had like a month to put the music together, so he reused some of his old songs, including a lot of stuff he wrote for Meatloaf and, most famously, Total Eclipse of the Heart, which is the main theme of the musical.
Manchmal in der Nacht denk ich sollte lieber fliehen vor dir, solange ich es noch kann.
Before he gave that song to Bonnie Tyler in 1983, he actually originally conceived it for a musical version of Nosferatu that never saw the light of night. And the song's original title used to be Vampires in Love. So what better song to build a vampire musical around? And yes, Vampires in Love, because besides restoring the original Dance of the Vampires title, the musical switches the focus from the fearless killers to Sarah, making her the protagonist. And instead of her just having a dazed, lukewarm response to being rescued, the musical embraces her desire for the dark side and changes it from a virginal ruining to a triumph of empowerment. This is a girl who, despite being a good person, is drawn to the night by an inner darkness she doesn't understand but is desperate to seize. She's not a damsel in distress. She is on a mission of self-discovery. The vampire recognizes this in her and faces a conflict of his own, battling his desire for blood and death with true feelings of love. Meanwhile, Alfred is no longer a horny, bumbling weirdo, but instead fills out the love triangle as a pure innocent, who is too naive to understand Sarah's complexities until the end when he becomes a vampire and seizes the night as well. The show is campy and over the top and downright glorious. If you understand German, or don't mind subtitles. They did translate it to English and bring it to Broadway, but, well, first of all, Polanski couldn't come over to direct it because of that pesky being imprisoned for child rape if he sets foot on American soil thing. So Jim Steinman tried to direct it himself, but the Broadway producers were afraid audiences here wouldn't get on board with the glam rock Euro trashy sincerity of the show. So they fired him and transformed it from dark humor into Mel Brooks style slapstick comedy. Also, since everyone was already calling it basically rocked out Phantom of the Opera with vampires, they hired the original Phantom of the Opera himself, Michael Crawford, to play the Count. But the last thing he wanted was for people to say that he was just playing the Phantom all over again, so he made them change it even more. More comedy, he cried, more! Cram all those jokes in there! And the Broadway version wound up so tonally different from the original that all fans of the German version hate it. Critics hated it too, and the show became one of the costliest failures in Broadway history when it closed in disgrace after less than 7 weeks. Considering the producers marketed it as a musical for people who think musicals suck, did they expect the musical-going public to feel encouraged to buy tickets? Cute pun aside, condescending much? Also, it was in pre-production right when 9/11 happened, which caused all kinds of setbacks. They postponed the previews and opening to the following fall, but even a year later, we were still struggling to bounce back in New York. I first saw the show knowing nothing of the original, and was met with a spectacle that not only meticulously parodied all of my favorite vampire tropes, but also the classic musical theater tropes I could laugh at as an MT student. And yes, it was hilarious to witness the Michael Crawford break out into Total Eclipse of the Heart. It wasn't awesome or deep, but it was funny and twisted. I wound up seeing it 7 times when they were practically giving tickets away at the end, which was heaven for a broke college student. And at every single performance, the audience laughed uproariously throughout the whole thing. So what can I say? For those of us who actually went to see it, it did something right. I loved it, and all you Tonspears can throw things at me if you must, but I moved to New York City alone 2 weeks before 9/11, and after that year, I for one sure appreciated the opportunity for some cathartic laughter in the face of death.
At the total eclipse of the moon?
At the total eclipse of the moon.
On Halloween?
At midnight.
Is it too good?
However, that said, if you would like some vampire horror comedy without the taint of Hollywood sexual predator controversy surrounding it, leave this movie collecting cobwebs on the shelf and go watch What We Do in the Shadows instead. I am the maven of the eventide, and dance with me, my friends. Dance the dance of death.
And we'll only be making it right, 'cause we'll never be wrong. Together we can take it to the end of the line. My love is like a shadow on you all of the time.
If Memento Mori exists to remind us that death is always right around the corner and to live our lives to the fullest, as fleeting as they are, then skull-collecting goths are really the liveliest of us all. Thank you, Patreon patrons. I couldn't do this without you. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave me comments. Follow me on Twitter, and tell me your favorite Memento Mori or Danse Macabre.